Federal regulations today impose, by some estimates, a burden of about $1.88 trillion on the economy. That's roughly $15,000 for every single household in this country. And it's more than corporate and individual income taxes combined. Too much regulation, especially too much outdated regulation, means higher prices, smaller paychecks, and fewer jobs for hardworking Americans. Now, every president since Jimmy Carter has agreed on the need to review our regulatory burden, make sure that it is no more intrusive and burdensome. That is absolutely necessary. Nevertheless, regulations keep accumulating year after year. The Code of Federal Regulations is now more than 175,000 pages and contains more than 200 volumes. And according to a study by the American Action Forum, the Obama administration's efforts to review old rules actually added more than $23 billion in cost to the economy and nearly 9 million hours of paperwork. And that's why I've introduced the Scrub Act, which uses the successful model of the independent BRAC Commission and applies it to get rid of a big chunk of regulatory overreach and burden. Now, I just wonder if you agree with me that far from providing small businesses with relief from our crushing regulatory burden, the Obama administration's regulations have made the business environment much more challenging, especially for minority-owned businesses. And do you agree with me that simply relying on Washington bureaucrats to get rid of their own bad regulations is like asking the proverbial bunch of foxes to guard the chicken coop?
Thank you for your question, sir. I think with most minority business and business in general, we used to talk about, my dad used to like to talk about this. He goes, when you work with government, I don't want your hand out. I'm not even concerned about your hand up. I don't even want your hand shake when it comes to regulators, because really once you get out of my way. Because I want to have the freedom to do business in the best way they can. And regulators, like we talked about, for every law passed, they passed 16 new regulations for every law passed. Right. How can people do that? And they keep piling on one and the other. And I can almost guarantee you that any law that we have now, it's already there. We don't need to go do more and don't need any more new regulations, because I can guarantee you it's already there. But if I do agree that we need to go in and see what we have so we know what we got to get rid of. And I think one of the best quotes I've ever heard is from Colorado. It's all fine and great when we pass new laws, but come and tell me what you got rid of. Because the more you get rid of them, gives me more freedom to do business. And I think everybody on this panel would agree, we're not against regulation. We want clean air, we want safe food. Nobody's against that. But it's the overregulation that's really depressing the freedom and spirit and ingenuity and hard work attitudes of true Americans to prosper. We've talked about some of the other things going on here. A lot of the problems that we have here are due to poverty. And poverty occurs because there's no economic ability to get out of poverty. So if you keep depressing business, particularly small business, to prosper, you're only going to hurt poverty, and we need to work on that.
Well, thank you, Mr. Senator. We've heard extensive testimony about the explosive growth of federal regulations and their troubling effect on economic opportunity, especially in minority communities. Now, despite these harmful effects, regulations keep piling up, as both Mr. Barrera and I have been saying, making the situation worse and worse with each passing year. Now, this massive accumulation of regulations is due in large part to the fact that the current process by which agencies make regulations is utterly broken. From curtailing the opportunity for meaningful input by the public to flouting the legal requirements for transparency and accountability. Now, given this mess, the courts are often the only practical means of holding this out-of-control bureaucracy accountable. But doesn't excessive deference by courts to agencies critically limit that opportunity to hold the agencies accountable? Instead, hasn't this deference allowed the agencies to expand the scope of their power dramatically, allowing them to pile up more and more damaging regulations?
Oh, yes, Senator, absolutely. The problem is that courts defer so excessively to the administrative agencies that agencies have become basically a fourth branch of government, unelected, hired, Many of these administrative agencies are staffed by members of government unions, so you can't even fire them if you have to, who write regulations, investigate potential violations of those regulations, and then punish people for violating those regulations in violation of the constitutional principle of separation of powers. And courts not only defer to their decision-making in general, but they defer to their findings in ways that violate basic rules of due process. So, for example, a lot of the time, administrative agencies will hold informal hearings, and the evidence that they're allowed to receive, they're not bound by the federal rules of evidence, and so they can receive evidence like hearsay, for instance, which would be barred from a courtroom. Then when you appeal from the administrative agency, and you're always going to lose in front of the administrative agency because the prosecutor's paying the judge, right? So when you appeal to the court, a lot of the time, this is especially true of state courts, the courts are locked. They're not allowed to receive any more evidence than what the administrative agency already received. So evidence that would never have been admitted in a courtroom, like hearsay evidence, becomes the only evidence that the judge is later able to consider when he considers the appeal. That's in violation of basic principles of due process. So we need a judiciary that is more skeptical toward administrative agencies, that are unelected agencies, that enjoy often extremely broad power to regulate in whatever they think is the public interest without any checks and balances. That's what the courts are supposed to provide, and unfortunately they've fallen short many times.
I've gone over my time, but let me just make one comment. You know, it's said by many people that the D.C. Federal District Court and the Circuit Court of Appeals are so pro-regulation. And they're the courts that hear these matters more than almost any other.
Right.
And frankly, almost always find on the side of the regulatory bodies. And I think they got to wake up and start realizing that they're part of the problem as well. And I'm very concerned about it because, you know, we see minorities, not just minorities, but minorities in particular, who are just getting killed by this over-regulatory nature of our society. I'm hoping we can get that scrub back through. That would start to peel through all these over-regulatory approaches and allow the good regulations to stay.
If I may agree with that, one of the big problems is that we don't know the costs of regulation, and we can't assess those costs because the costs of regulation typically take the form of the businesses that are never started, the projects that are never begun, the people who look at how difficult it is and say, well, why should I even bother? So when we hear statistics that say, well, existing businesses are fine with the regulatory burden, of course they are. They're already in business. They can afford to absorb those costs, but entrepreneurs, they can't, and very often they give up, and then we never see the wealth that they could have created, but which was stifled by the regulatory burdens.
Well, sometimes we justify this over-regulatory approach because of the ills of our society, but we've got to have the guts to get involved and look at the stuff that we don't need and get rid of it and save the trillions of dollars that we're losing right now because of this over-regulatory nature of our society. And I think it's very important for the minority community to, throughout the country, to take this on and start realizing that, you know, the federal government is not the last answer to everything. And frankly, in many ways, it's the impediment in our society because we don't get rid of the bad stuff. And yet you're still having to comply with a lot of bad things that really tear up, especially minority businesses. So I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and also the distinguished senator from Delaware for allowing me to go over a little bit. Thank you. And I want to thank all of you for being here today. It's been very helpful.
Thank you, Senator Hatch.